Gerontodon asks, what does I signify? In what context? I is in reference to my state of consciousness, in that I can say I am and conceive of my own existence, or, I don't know, I in the sense that it can represent a singularity, a oneness. The user Gremlin7 asks a very interesting question. How will the religious conceptions of soul and sin be challenged by the emergence of truly AI beings displaying intelligence and claiming to be conscious and demanding rights? Will robots need to be saved? Well, it seems to me that the emergence of artificial entities that are aware of their own existence in an intelligent manner, beings that are able to conceive of the notion I am, and that I require or have a right to this, will force the redefinition of what constitutes a soul. You have to bear in mind, it will not necessarily be a new context as such. The religious definition of what constitutes a soul has been forcibly reassessed and redefined many times by discoveries and emergences such as the sequencing of the genome, the proliferation of evolutionary theory, even the Copernican idea of the sun not being the centre of the universe. And I imagine that scientific discovery will continually force it to be reassessed. And I imagine the way that established churches will react to the emergence of artificial intelligences is in the same way they've reacted to every other scientific discovery that has challenged the status quo or the traditional preconceptions upon which their advertised truth is based. In that there will be resistance, then there will be a slow erosion of that resistance over time, and eventually there will be a forced redefinition of those truths in order to constitute the new circumstances. In fact, it's entirely possible that there will eventually be churches that cater to artificial intelligences. Now that's interesting. That really is interesting. I think there's a story in there, a short story, a novel, who knows, but there is definitely a story in there. Very interesting. I think it depends to a certain degree on how closely those intelligences that are created reflect us. If you accept that religions are effectively byproducts and expressions of our most fundamental drives, our fears, our desires, etc., then whether or not artificial intelligences will require some sort of similar expression or structure will depend on whether they function within the same parameters. So, for example, it's not necessarily so that artificial intelligences will have a body or a physical form. They may be just programs that exist on the internet, or whatever the internet has become at that point. In which instance the parameters will shift dramatically, and the constraints under which they function will also be very different. Therefore, whether or not they will require notions such as the soul or religious structure is a matter that is wide open for debate. I mean, I have no doubt that it will pose very significant problems for established churches and for the notion of the soul as it currently stands. Because insofar as I'm concerned, if a creature is intelligently capable of conceiving I am and expressing it in a coherent manner, then it is alive. And in that regard it is worthy of recognition and rights, whether it is artificially created or not. And I can foresee a new form of prejudice emerging from that, from both religious and non-religious circles, as to whether or not these entities, if they occur at all, constitute living beings and if they are worthy of respect. I mean, there are many sci-fi authors that go into this. Philip K. Dick goes into it a lot, as does William Gibson, and there are also various films such as Ghost in the Shell, its derivative, The Matrix, And of course Blade Runner, which is an adaptation of the book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And to be quite honest, it's a notion that is so complicated that I don't think all we can do here is scratch the surface. But I thank you for giving me material for a later video. That's certainly planted some very, very interesting philosophical seeds in my mind. Shadizar666 asks, where did you get your accent? Well, actually, that's quite an interesting one, because I should technically talk like my parents. You'd think so, wouldn't you? But my dad comes from Tamworth, or Tamworth, so he talks a bit like that. He talks a bit like that, me dad. Whereas me mum comes from Derbyshire, where they all talk like that, and it's a bit laconic, really. If you hear the Derbyshire accent, then it doesn't matter what you say. It sounds like you're moaning. I won lottery the other day. 50 million. But I don't speak like either of them, which is strange. And my brother doesn't either. My brother doesn't speak like me either. He speaks like he speaks like a proper Brummie, like someone who comes from Birmingham for some bizarre reason. I don't know where I got my accent from. I can only put it up to a misspent youth reading a lot of books. I think that's where it comes from. I speak how I think in my head and how I read. And that's the only explanation I can think of. Violet Cosmonaut asks, what do you like to read? Oh, goodness. Anything. Anything and everything. There's not much I don't like to read. I read so much. But what do I prefer to read? Well, I'm into cult literature and anything that's slightly deviant. I particularly like works of horror. Very, very, very black fantasy. The kind of fantasy of confrontation, I suppose you could say, that's rooted in reality, that acts as a reflection of reality. So my favourite authors are Clive Barker, Neil Gaiman, Mary Shelley, Bret Easton Ellis, Poppy Z. Bright, and Angela Carter. But there are so many others as well. I love Dostoevsky. I think Dostoevsky is one of the most superlative writers I've ever come across, and Crime and Punishment is one of my favourite books because the complexity and the psychological insight that he crams into just a couple of sentences that many writers can't manage in entire books is amazing, truly astounding. But I will technically read anything. The only things I really do shy away from are things such as romances, Mills and Boon books. I despise bad horror or bad fantasy, or the sort of stuff that's derived from Tolkien, for example, where it's elves and orcs and all this stuff. I like Tolkien quite a lot, but I despise what he spawned, because all you've got are people who are trying to be Tolkien but just aren't doing it as well, which is annoying. I like Terry Pratchett quite a lot. He makes me laugh. And I'm rather fond of the Hannibal books up until Hannibal. The book Hannibal is appalling. It's appalling for so many reasons. The previous two are quite interesting and wonderful. I like them a lot. But the book Hannibal is hideous for a number of reasons. But I don't want to go into here because that's a whole other video. Oh yes, why the book Hannibal is shit. Vincent Womack. Hello, sir. Vincent Womack asks, what's the last film you've seen or the last DVD you bought? Oh, Vincent, I'm ashamed to say this, but the last film I went to see was A Haunting in Connecticut. And I didn't go to see it by choice. I wanted to go to the cinema and there was a choice between two films. There was Knowledge, which has Nicolas Cage in it, and then there was A Haunting in Connecticut. Now, I seriously begrudge watching anything with Nicolas Cage, because the man is an awful actor. Genuinely appalling. And since he appeared in that fucking insulting remake of The Wicker Man, I love The Wicker Man, the original, but that piece of trash is an insult to everyone involved, quite frankly. I seriously begrudge watching anything with him in, because he's just not engaging. So I went to see a horror, and I do like horror. I love horror films a great deal, but I'm picky. I'm very, very picky indeed. I describe being a horror fan as like sifting through shit to find diamonds. Occasionally you do find them, but there's a hell of a lot of shit you've got to shovel first. The Haunting in Connecticut is shit. Unadulterated, derivative, predictable shite. It's a haunted house movie, and if you've ever seen the original Amityville Horror or The Shining, or even Alien, which is a haunted house movie in space, then you've seen it done before and you've seen it done better. If you will know exactly what's going to happen from the very first frames of Haunting in Connecticut. It's not even done particularly well. An appalling film. And I do believe that is that. Thank you very much indeed for listening. I hope this was enlightening.